Hi, everybody, and welcome to our latest in our series of interviews with Sigma Xi's distinguished lecturers. I'm Fenella Saunders. I'm the managing editor for American Scientist magazine, which is published by Sigma Xi. I'd like to particularly welcome all of the Sigma Xi members who are watching today. You can post additional questions on the YouTube live page that accompanies this. And also, if you would like to ask additional questions after the broadcast, you can go to the Sigma Xi's communities page and also post your questions there, which we will get to our speaker. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by M.V. Ramana, who is a physicist with the program on science and global security at Princeton University. He is one of Sigma Xi's distinguished lecturers. I would also like to encourage Sigma Xi members, if you want to continue this discussion in more detail, Dr. Ramana, as a distinguished lecturer, can be invited to speak at your chapter, and you could take advantage of that as well. But thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ramana.
Thank you very much for having me.
So this is a very widespread and contentious issue, which has to do with nuclear power options. So I think today we'll probably only be touching on a couple of pieces of that. So I also would like to point out that we've posted in the Sigma Xi's community pages and on social media some links to other papers written by Dr. Ramana. So if you're looking for additional information, that's a good place to start. But thank you again, Dr. Ramana.
Thank you, Fenella.
So first, oh yeah, of course. First of all, since it's sort of a turning point in the nuclear industry, I wondered if we could give a little bit of an overview of the Fukushima Daiichi incident that happened, I guess, about 5 years ago now, and compare it maybe to some of the previous problems that have happened with nuclear power reactors, most notably 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl.
Sure. So in 2011, on March 11th, a tsunami struck the coast of Japan. And at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, there were 3 operating reactors there, and they lost cooling as a result of the tsunami. Essentially, what happened was that the backup power generator, the station suffered an electrical power loss because the grid went down as a result of the earthquake that preceded the tsunami. And then the station lost all of the backup electricity generators that it had on site. And as a result, there was no way to cool the reactor. And one of the problems with any nuclear power plant is that the fuel, even if you shut down the reactor, continues to keep generating heat because of the radioactivity of the fission products that have accumulated in the reactor. And this heat has to be continuously transported out of the reactor. In the case of Fukushima Daiichi, that was no longer happening. And as a result, was essentially a meltdown. The meltdown also resulted in hydrogen gas being produced inside the reactor as a result of reactions between the so-called zirconium cladding that surrounds nuclear fuel pellets and the steam that's being produced as a result of water boiling. And it is sort of essentially what happens is that the oxygen in the H2O, the water molecules, get stripped away, and the hydrogen gets liberated. And eventually there was enough hydrogen for a hydrogen explosion that led to the radionuclides that were being generated inside the nuclear reactor to be expelled into the atmosphere. And this then contaminated both the surrounding countryside, and large amounts of it went over the Pacific Ocean, contaminating the ocean. And in comparison with some of the earlier reactor accidents that you mentioned, compared to Chernobyl, Fukushima Daiichi probably resulted in about something like an eighth to a quarter of the amount of cesium 137, which is the most significant long-term radionuclide that contaminates, being released. But most of it was carried over the Pacific Ocean, so there was not that much damage to human health. And in comparison with Three Mile Island, which is sort of more pertinent to people in the United States, there was much less amount of radioactivity that was released from Three Mile Island.
Right. Okay. So this is an interesting point because a lot of the oceanic contamination that Fukushima caused has been prominently displayed in the news. There's a lot of imagery of it. So it's interesting that perhaps the tsunami actually caused some of the problems. So the coastal location of the plant was a problem for that reason, but having internally situated power plants, nuclear power plants, causes different kinds of problems if there is some kind of meltdown.
Right. So I think what one should learn from both Fukushima and the other two accidents is that external events like tsunamis or hurricanes or earthquakes can lead to an accident, but they are not a necessary condition. In that, in the two other major accidents that we talked about, there was no external stimulus. There were purely internal problems. So reactors are very complicated, and so they can have accidents due to all kinds of reasons.
Yes, of course, certainly. Now, the other point that I think we might want to talk about here is the current sort of state of nuclear power usage in the world right now. So as I understand it, I think you've written that there's something along the lines of 400 operational plants in the world and about 100 in the US at the moment, although operational can mean different things.
Right. So there are, I think the International Atomic Energy Agency counts about 450 operating plants, but of which about 43 are in Japan. And of them, only 2 are operating at the moment. And it's not clear how many of the ones that are not operating at this point will ever come back. Most of them were shut down in the aftermath of Fukushima. So that's the current number there. Likewise, in the United States, though there are 100, there are quite a few which are scheduled to be shut down over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Is there some kind of number we can give for context in terms of the amount of power generated by nuclear compared to all sources of power?
Yeah, so nuclear power generates roughly about 11% of the world's electricity as of last year. And this is a number that has been declining steadily. The highest it has been was in 1996, when it was about 17.6%. So it's been roughly about a 39% decline since then.
Mm-hmm. And is that because of economic factors or because of public perception or some combination?
I think there are multiple factors going on here. Economics certainly plays a very important part. Nuclear power plants are very expensive to construct. They also take a very long time to construct. And so you cannot quickly build up a nuclear power capacity. Public perception has certainly played a part too, though it's a much harder thing to quantify. So it's a combination of these multiple factors that I think are responsible. The world has also been using far less electricity than had been anticipated in the past. People thought the energy demand will keep growing and growing and growing, and that has not really happened around the world. There are many countries where energy consumption has been fairly stagnant, including the United States.
Oh, that's very interesting. Does that mean that conservation efforts might be actually having some kind of effect, or is there other reasons?
Absolutely. That certainly happens. It certainly has had an effect in the United States. It's had even more of an effect in Japan. So in the case of Japan, for example, all the electricity that used to be produced by nuclear power before Fukushima has been replaced largely by 3 things. One is natural gas, the second is renewables, and the third is energy efficiency.
Wow, so that's an interesting combination there as well. Well, I'd like to get back to renewables in a few, but first of all, I wonder if we could talk about there are currently nuclear power plants, new ones being built. I think some of the data you've presented before say it's approximately 60 currently in the world being built, about 20 of which appear to be in China. I'm wondering also if you can talk about safety updates that may be happening with these reactors in light of the problems that occurred at Fukushima.
So most countries around the world undertook some kind of safety assessments of their reactor fleets and of what they were constructing. Many of them did implement new safety measures. And to the extent that they have been implemented, one assumes that these fleets are going to be safer, as are newer plants. At the same time, I think the question that you seem to be getting at is, can we really be sure that these reactors are not going to have an accident? And there, I think the answer is one can just not be sure about this. There's always going to be a possibility of an accident, regardless of what kind of reactor it is.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely do want to get to that point as well. But one of the points of discussion that I've heard talked about in terms of development of new nuclear reactors has been the economics of power generation at this point in time with new technologies such as fracking, which is driving fuel costs down, which makes it sort of less economically viable to even invest in nuclear. Can you talk about how that is affecting the nuclear power generation market?
Absolutely. In the United States, except in a few states down south, which are markets which are regulated, in most other states, it makes no economic sense whatsoever to invest in a new nuclear plant. A new nuclear plant today, if you look at the ones that are being constructed in Georgia and South Carolina, they're all running typically around $15 to $20 billion for about 2,000 megawatts of generating capacity. And the cost of electricity from these is much higher than one can expect from most of the alternatives. Natural gas is one that we talked about because of fracking. Natural gas prices are very low, but renewables have also become extremely cheap. And as a result, roughly speaking, the Wall Street financial firm called Lazard, which produces an annual estimate of costs, estimates that electricity from a new nuclear plant would cost roughly double that of electricity from a solar photovoltaic farm.
So that's also a fairly recent development, I would say, too, in terms of renewables coming down in cost, because that's always been one of the problems with renewables, as I understand it.
Right. Renewables for a very long time, the concern with them was they would be too expensive, but that's changed dramatically in the last decade, especially in the last few years. Wind started the decline first, and then in the last few years, solar has really become also catching up with that.
So do you think that there will be more of a political climate or a social climate towards using more renewables because the cost has come down? So this is sort of a combined factor where you might get some sort of snowball effect momentum going on there?
Certainly, yes. I mean, I think if you look at public opinion polls around the world, there's overwhelming majority in most countries for continued construction of renewables. I think that's certainly a plus factor. The cost coming down has become an important factor. A third thing that is important to note is that it takes much less time to put up a wind turbine or a solar photovoltaic farm as compared to a nuclear reactor.
Right, okay. And I definitely like to get into some of those cross economics there in terms also of I guess, scalability with nuclear versus other renewable sorts of energies in terms of being able to have smaller footprints, more distributed sources, for instance. In terms, I know that there's been some investment in smaller modular nuclear reactors over the last few years, but I think that's always been a factor that's been positive about renewables, is that you can have, say, one or two wind turbines. You don't have to have a gigantic farm, and you can move those to sort of different locations and still have the same sort of overall impact on power generation. Is that correct?
Right. So in the case of wind, though, you have to look at where the wind is blowing. So it's not going to be moved everywhere, but so the location might be dependent on the resources available. However, you're quite right that wind and solar tend to be much more modular in their nature of construction. Nuclear reactors could also be modular in the sense that you could build small power plants. And in fact, the oldest nuclear power plants were small nuclear power plants. But there was a reason why nuclear power plants became big. They were always very expensive. And the only way that the nuclear industry could see how to lower costs of electricity generation in nuclear power plants was to take advantages of economies of scale. So it doesn't take twice as much concrete, or it doesn't take twice as many workers to operate a plant that is generating twice as much electricity. And therefore, you save on some of the costs. And therefore, when you think about small reactors, again, you're going to lose on those economies of scale. And so nuclear already being economically challenged, it's hard to imagine how a small reactor is going to be economically better off.
So can we talk about why it's so expensive to build a nuclear reactor and how that factor has been overcome in the past? Has that just been because of incentives and things like that? Or are there other reasons why that hasn't been necessarily a factor in building these when there was sort of a nuclear heyday?
I think the nuclear heyday, it's hard to see, in today's perspective, what they were thinking then. But I think there was a lot of expectation that nuclear power might be expensive now, but in the future, they're going to become cheaper. And the second thing, which I think is important to remember about the heyday of nuclear power plant construction, was that almost all the projects were approved on much lower cost estimates than what actually came out. So practically all the reactors that were constructed in the United States in, let's say, the 1970s had huge overruns, maybe 200%, 300%. So in some sense, why they were constructed is not a good predictor of what actually happened. So that's one deal. I think the second thing to remember is that there was the overwhelming feeling that energy demand will keep growing and growing, what we talked about earlier. And so we're going to be requiring all the possible sources of power. And that also did not come out to be true.
So one of the factors that's always been true with nuclear is the perception of risk from a disaster, where the potential seems greater with nuclear than potentially with other kinds of fuels, particularly fossil fuels. But I'm wondering if, is it just because it's more visible? Or is it possible to draw comparisons with the kind of disastrous, potentially climate change caused by fossil fuels that has been sort of more diffuse over the long term compared to something like a nuclear disaster?
Yeah, comparing risks is always very tricky business. Nuclear power sort of suffers from a particular combination of risks which make it very hard for people to come to terms with. It's an unfamiliar risk. It's a risk that is fairly catastrophic at any given point, as opposed to a small number of deaths occurring year after year after year, as is the case with fossil fuel plants. It's a risk that probably runs across generations. People are concerned about what they're going to be leaving to their future progeny. It's also a risk about which people have very little control. So when people talk about comparisons between that and, let's say, risks of being in a car accident, people react very differently. And this is true for you and me, including you and me. So when I drive, I know there's a risk of an accident, but I also know that if I wear my seatbelt, if I drive within the speed limit, if I obey the sort of sensible laws, if I don't try to drive, let's say, at midnight on a Saturday night when I'm expecting many more drunk drivers and so on and so forth, my chances of an accident go down. I have no such control over what happens in a nuclear power plant, or for that matter, an airplane or something of that sort. So I'm going to treat those kinds of risks very differently. The numbers themselves do not mean a lot. I think in respect to climate change, it's another interesting thing. They share a lot of similarities in the kinds of magnitude and the kinds of lack of control that individual people have and so on. But I think the differences are that the climate is seen as something where there are multiple possible solutions. And people who are concerned about climate strongly also strongly support things like renewables and energy efficiency. Whereas people, that kind of options do not exist in the case of nuclear. In fact, if you think about it differently, the purpose of a nuclear power plant is to generate electricity. That's the only benefit it provides. If that benefit can be provided through other sources, then people say, why not we use that? And so nuclear also sort of suffers from that thing. And last but not least, I'd say that the two other interesting facts about the comparison between climate change and nuclear power. To the extent that people support nuclear power more as a result of climate change concerns, it's a very reluctant source of support. The people who are concerned about climate change also tend to be concerned about nuclear waste, about the risk of accidents and so on and so forth. And so they say, well, if there is no other option, then perhaps we will go in for nuclear. But given that we see there are rapid advances in renewables and other ways, then we would rather support that. The second thing which is interesting to note is that in the United States, if you look at the correlation between the people who support nuclear power, it's correlated very strongly with people who also deny climate change or who think that climate change is not a big problem, which is kind of an interesting thing. So the people who support nuclear power tend to be people who don't think climate change is a major problem, and that has to do with their sort of worldview. I won't get into that in any more detail for now.
So, but there is this interesting trend in the last few years in regards to climate change and nuclear power, and maybe it's not as widespread amongst the public base, but there have been some prominent liberal leaders who have come out in support of nuclear as an option to combat climate change. And I'm wondering if you think that that kind of public statement of support might change some minds in the public on the side of the people who are maybe more liberal, and also perhaps more reluctant to support nuclear as a form of abating climate change. Maybe they might be coming around to that perception. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some correlation between prominent leaders expressing support for nuclear power and how people react to that. There's also, if you look at public opinion polls as well, if you ask people whether they support new nuclear power construction, their answers very much depend on how you phrase the question or what kind of information you give them before. So if you tell people, for example, that nuclear power is one of the well-known ways of mitigating climate change, do you support building nuclear power plants? You're more likely to get a yes answer, as opposed to when you ask them, nuclear power plants cost a lot of money to build. Would you support that? So it depends on what kind of information you're feeding them. So in that sense, if you have a lot of prominent people supporting nuclear power, that's going to help with the public perception. But at the same time, that alone is not going to, I think, change the picture fundamentally.
So has public perception shifted much since 2011 when the Fukushima accident happened? Have you seen any significant changes in that trend, or has it been pretty much sort of stagnant in the sense of feeling sort of anti-nuclear since that time? I think it also depends what country people are from. Isn't that true?
So I think two things can be said. One is levels of support vary enormously from country to country. It also varies from public poll to public poll. As I said, depends on how the question is framed and so on. At the same time, I think it's also fair to say many studies have documented that around the world there was a decline in support for nuclear power in the aftermath of Fukushima. That has slowly come back up in the last few years because there's not been an accident since then. But every time there is something which happens in a nuclear power plant anywhere, that is going to affect that. So it's it's not a very robust source of support.
So one of the things I found was interesting in some of the studies you've cited is there's actually been at least some increase in support for nuclear power in places like Morocco and Spain. Is there a reason why that is?
Nobody really knows. Morocco has no nuclear power plants. Spain has basically one nuclear power plant, so it really doesn't have much nuclear power. So that one doesn't know really enough about.
Okay, so it's just kind of an
Morocco
anomaly.
is really an outlier. I mean, Spain is kind of within the error bars that you might expect, but Morocco is kind of strange. Yeah.
Interesting. It could be a polling error, I suppose, then, or something like that.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is in terms of there are some new technologies that people have been trying to develop with nuclear to make it safer for things, the kinds of reactions that basically automatically stop if there's some kind of disaster or cutoff or breakdown in the system. One example that we've looked at in American Scientists in our pages has been pebblebed reactors. And I wondered if you could talk about some of the cost benefits for developing technologies like that. On the one hand, these are sort of unproven technologies, and one of the arguments against them has been, well, that nobody really knows if they're safe or not. They look safe in small tests, but they'd have to build a big one to make sure, and you could never really tell, versus a more established nuclear technology, which might be more expensive or larger or have other drawbacks, but which has a proven safety record.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. So the pebblebed reactor has been one of those enigmatic reactors that nuclear engineers have pursued since the dawn of the nuclear age. The first design for a pebblebed reactor was in 1944, and it was meant to produce plutonium for the Manhattan Project, but it was not eventually adopted. So the pebblebed reactors do have some attractive safety features. In particular, they have, in physics terms, a very low power density. The amount of power that's being produced per unit volume is relatively low. That's what allows the heat to be radiated away quite easily compared to larger reactors. But that particular feature is also a problem when you think about it in terms of economics. What it means is that you're going to have to construct a much larger pressure vessel, a much larger containment dome, and so on and so forth, all of which is going to become more expensive to produce the same amount of electricity. So there are always going to be these trade-offs between multiple desires, multiple design goals that one might have. And it's not possible to optimize all of them simultaneously, right? So that's one issue. The second thing to remember is what you quite rightly said, all the experience we've had with pebblebed reactors, or more generally high temperature gas-cooled reactors. There are also another kind called prismatic type that the United States built two of, one in Peach Bottom and one in Fort St. Vrain in Colorado. Is that when they were trying commercially, they were all abject failures. They were all shut down well ahead of time. They did not make money. The Fort St. Vrain reactor was constantly down due to one problem or the other, so much so that the New York Times commented when the decision to close the reactor that world's safest reactor is shutting down because it hardly runs, or something of that sort. So, what looks good on paper, or PowerPoint for that matter, does not always translate well to the real world. And last thing which I would like to say is that nuclear power plants are very complex technologies. They are, it's very hard to envision how they will behave under different circumstances, in particular under times of accidents. Things also happen very fast, and one thing can quickly lead to another. So it's very hard to envision all possible accident modes. So you can only protect against those accident modes which you know about. If you can't predict some particular accident modes, it's very hard to imagine how the system will behave and how to protect it against those particular accident modes.
Right, that makes sense. So because there's so much about government and politics and perception that goes into what kinds of technologies are perhaps more readily adopted, and you'd mentioned before that it looks like people who accept nuclear power tend to be ones who don't think climate change is an issue. I'm wondering if there's an extension of that point, because in this country and perhaps in others, there has been over the last decade or so more mistrust in science and in trusting scientists as experts. Is there any connection with that to nuclear power usage in this case?
Yes and no. I think there is certainly among people who are concerned about science in general, you see them sort of revolting and, or not adopting vaccination or other kinds of things where lack of trust in science is sort of visible. There's probably some correlation between those people and those. But I think the vast majority of people who are concerned about nuclear power also quite often know a lot about science, who trust science. And it is the results of these science-based studies that lead them to be distrustful of predictions about how safe nuclear power plants are. And I think in many cases, the nuclear industry has not served itself well. So I can speak about India, for example, where the head of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission, after Fukushima, announced that the probability of a Fukushima-like accident in India is 1 in infinity. That is 0, in other words. And this is the kind of very overconfident statement which actually leads people not to trust people of that sort, scientists of that sort.
You've mentioned in some of your papers something about that. I think you called it the safety myth. Is that correct?
This is actually something which the Japanese, started talking about. Yeah. So in Japan, there was this overwhelming sentiment that was propagated by the nuclear industry saying these reactors will never have an accident. And people believed in that till Fukushima happened. So that's the people in Japan have termed it the safety myth, and I think it's a very important insight into how people think about it.
And from what you've written, it looks like that sort of myth is being propagated in China as well, because they're saying we've taken all these safety measures since Fukushima.
That's right. So in China, I think there's certainly this battle is going on in a big way. And in the case of China, it's a very interesting case because China has the fastest growing nuclear power industry anywhere in the world. And yet they are faced with a fairly important decision that's coming up, which has to do with where they build their nuclear power plants. So far, all the nuclear power plants that have been built in China have been built on the coast. And prior to Fukushima, there were plans to construct nuclear power plants inland as well, away from the sea, in which case it would have to be near one of the large rivers or lakes or so on, because all nuclear reactors require sources of cooling water. And this has been strongly resisted both by the public as well as fairly high-level decision makers. In China, of course, a lot of the decision making happens, opacally to the outside. But clearly, there's a section of people who think that we cannot undertake this risk. So the nuclear industry in China has been saying, oh, you don't have to worry about it. The new designs that we're constructing are all perfectly safe and so on. And on the other side, there are people saying, well, we still cannot be sure, and we don't want to risk, contaminating our agricultural land and our rivers with this.
Right. So this is a sort of related question, but in Fukushima and in other places, there's been the question of not just regulation, but enforcement of existing regulations as being a factor that can play into this debate. And it reminds me of reading about during sort of the Soviet Russia times when they were building nuclear reactors during those times, how some amount of funding from Moscow heading to Siberia would, every intermediary official would take a little cut out of that. So by the time it got to Siberia, you'd have basically forced labor trying to build a nuclear power plant without bulldozers and with inferior concrete, because all the funding had been corrupted out of the process. And although obviously that's not the same situation that's happening now in the world, it makes you wonder if you can take sort of an example from that extreme to making sure that regulations that exist now are actually enforced and that corruption doesn't hamper this process. I'm wondering if you can address that point at all.
Yeah. So I think existing regulations, there's two kinds of problems with it. One is that existing regulations sometimes just don't go far enough. And the second is that even those that are present on paper are not implemented. And there are sort of two aspects of it. I think there's the corruption part of it, and that's true in many countries as far as we know. In those countries where the corruption is a big problem, usually it's also accompanied by a lack of transparency. So one can't say definitively that there is corruption. You can just hear anecdotal stories. But in countries like the United States, there's a different problem. And the different problem has to do with the fact that the nuclear industry is very strong, and yet it's facing a huge economic barrier in terms of trying to compete in the electricity marketplace. So one of the arguments the nuclear industry has made to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and so on is that if you impose these very strict regulations on us, then we will not be able to compete economically. It'll cost us money to upgrade our plants, and that would that would force us to shut down these plants, and you don't want that. And there's of course some amount of political support for nuclear power plants to keep running. And so there are plants that are running which have not, I think, upgraded their safety adequately since Fukushima. There are about over 20 reactors that are essentially the same design as Fukushima that are still operating here, which have not significantly been upgraded.
So is there any way of telling if regulations in some place like China are being enforced sufficiently, or is that part of the debate there, but it's sort of internally?
It's an internal debate. I cannot say something definitively. There are people who, you get, shall we say, tidbits every now and then. So the French nuclear regulator who had to interact fairly closely with the Chinese nuclear regulator, because China is building a French reactor design there, did make a comment sometimes saying, they are really overworked, they're sort of not enough people, and they are trying to manage a huge number of construction projects at the same time, things of that sort, which make you think that things may not be quite hunky-dory.
Right, okay. So when we're talking about sort of this decreasing cost of their renewable energies and how that's making nuclear possibly less competitive, one of the arguments that people often give, and one of the questions that's actually come up in our communities page, is that even though that's maybe the case now, the ramp-up time to producing significant energy from renewables is too long, and that we need to be acting now to be sort of getting alternate fuels in so that there's some impact on climate change. And so you need to be using nuclear because it's more established over something like renewables. Do you have any insight on that kind of argument?
So this is a very, contentious subject. And there are sort of multiple both perspectives and multiple issues to be considering. So there are two different things which I think one should distinguish between. One is keeping existing nuclear power plants alive and keeping them operating. The other is building new nuclear power plants. When you think about new nuclear power plants, I think the argument is it does not work at all. It takes much less time to ramp up renewable power production as compared to nuclear power plants, simply because nuclear power plants take a very long time to construct. With respect to existing power plants, I think it's a more complicated thing. If you suddenly were to shut down a nuclear power plant and say, okay, so from tomorrow onwards, this is not going to be generating any more electricity, what are you going to do? And I think the only way that most utilities can deal with that is to ramp up their fossil fuel sources of power. But on the other hand, you can look at the example of what happened in California recently when the Diablo Canyon plant, there was a decision to shut it down over the next 10 years. So the two reactors are going to be shut down in 2024 and 2025. And PG&E, the local utility, has basically said that they will replace it with a combination of renewables and efficiency. So there's going to be no net increase in the generation of greenhouse gases. That kind of a model seems to be much more likely. The question is, can they shut down Diablo Canyon and build a new nuclear power plant to replace it? And there, I think the economics is just too negative at this point. So I don't think any utility that has concerned about its profitability is going to take that decision very easily.
So are renewables sort of mature enough to the point where they can be scaled up to basically fill in the amount of power generation that's needed?
This is again a tricky question in that, the problem with renewables is that they're intermittent. You generate electricity when the wind is blowing and when the sun is shining. And the question that you're asking is, can you actually think about generating all your electricity, or at least a significant fraction of your electricity, from these kind of intermittent sources? And I think the answer has to be tentative. We don't really know because this has never been done. But on the other hand, there are a large number of pieces of the puzzle that seem to be coming together. So there are ways by which you can try to deal with this intermittency. Essentially, there are three ways that you can think about it. One is if you have geographical diversity in where you're generating all these powers, so that it's possible that there's no wind blowing here in New Jersey, but hopefully in North Carolina or in Minnesota or something, the wind is blowing at this point. So those things can compensate for each other. The second is that you could try to do more on the demand side. You not need electricity all the time. I'm not talking about reduction as much as moving your demand around. So this is so-called smart grid idea. That's the buzzword that goes around. And last but not least, there is the possibility of storage of electricity. And all of these are sort of still moving parts. I mean, the technologies are not perfect yet, but things are changing very fast in that landscape as compared to the nuclear landscape. And so I think one can be cautiously optimistic about renewables being able to bear a much larger share than they do now. What that final figure is going to be, I don't know. And I don't think we should be making very definitive claims about what can be possible and what's not possible.
Okay, so just to go back to nuclear itself for just a minute, one of the pieces we haven't really talked about is the waste disposal piece. And obviously that's an enormous piece related to nuclear power. So is that, I mean, I know that that has to be factored in when these plants are even planned and built. It's something that's taken into account at the very beginning. But is that sufficient at this point for the amount of storage that's needed? Are there sort of new technologies that can help make that safer or better in some ways for existing plants?
So there are two aspects to that. One is, well, actually you said three things that I want to comment on. The first is, is waste generation, waste management planned for in the beginning of the cycle? And I think the answer for that has to be no. Whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, many countries had assumed that within a couple of decades or when they built their first power plant, they would start having waste repositories operating, geological repositories. In the United States, for example, in the 1950s, the National Academy of Sciences proposed that we should construct, the best way to deal with nuclear waste would be to construct a underground geological repository. To date, that has not happened. We all know about the Yucca Mountain proposal, which sort of gone up and down, but it's not operational. There is, in fact, no operational waste storage facility, underground waste storage facility for permanent disposal for commercial radioactive nuclear waste. So that's one thing. When it comes to countries that are now building nuclear power plants, their first nuclear power plants, again, they are not seem to be planning this ahead. Many of them assume that eventually something will happen. Let the United States solve the problem, let France solve the problem, and then we will sort of adopt that. So that's the first thing which I want to say. The second thing is, I think, coming to the question of the waste repository itself, what we have learned over the last few decades of many countries trying to set up these kind of nuclear waste repositories is that the task is much harder than was originally envisioned. Most people thought the problem would be finding a suitable geological site. And once you find a site, you just dig a deep hole and you sort of bury all the waste there. And it turns out that that's not the main problem. The main problem is trying to find a community that is willing to live near one of these waste repositories and, with all the risks that come with it, not just for themselves, but for tens of thousands of years out in the future. And most communities, quite naturally don't want that to happen. And so what I think happened around the world was initially groups of scientists and engineers would get together and they would decide, okay, here's where we want to construct this nuclear repository. And then they would make this announcement. And of course, then there would be a huge amount of protest from the local people, opposition from the local people. And these guys would try to defend their decision. And eventually, in most cases, they would abandon it. And so in the United Kingdom, there was this acronym that was coined, which is DADA: decide, announce, defend, abandon. And so this is kind of the pattern that you see in many, many different countries. So now they're sort of talking about, let's start with trying to find a community that is willing to do this and then set up one of these things. Again, that's not something which has happened so far, with two exceptions, which are Sweden and Finland, which are sort of have found sites. They still haven't constructed the repository. There are still open technical and other sort of political questions before this thing actually becomes operational. But nevertheless, they've made a start, at least with respect to identifying the potential sites. Most of the countries have not done that. Last but not least, there is a huge amount of waste already. And what are we going to do about that? And there, I think some of the issues about the things which you're talking about, better technologies to deal with the waste where it is right now, especially through the use of what are called dry casks, there have been advances there. And so it's in a way safer to store them on site today as opposed to maybe 20 years ago. That's all we can say.
So can you explain what dry casks are and how they work that's different than how disposal might have been done previously?
So it's not so much as disposal as much as storage.
Storage, right,
so
yeah.
In most nuclear power plants, what happens is that after the fuel goes through the nuclear reactor, it comes out radioactive and hot. And so it has to be kept under water. The water both cools the fuel and also damps some of the radioactive discharges that are happening. And so it's stored in these large spent fuel ponds for several decades. It can vary from 5 years to essentially indefinitely in many places. But what happens is that most of these reactors initially assumed that after like a couple of decades, there would be a place for this waste to go to. And so they never built ponds that were sufficient to hold all the fuel for decades and decades of operation. So what they basically did was they started storing these in what's called densely packed things. So have twice as much fuel, let's say, stored in the same amount of volume as was originally designed for a certain amount of fuel. And with that kind of packing, the chances of a spent fuel fire becomes much higher. So for some reason, if the pool drains and the water goes out of the pool, then you could imagine that the zirconium will start catching fire, and that can release a huge amount of radioactivity. In principle, some of these large reactors, ponds, have more spent fuel in them than what was released in Chernobyl. And so you could have potentially a much larger accident in all of these places. So it's that configuration of storing of nuclear fuel that's considered the most dangerous. So dry cask essentially is that once the fuel has been in the pond, in the spent fuel pool for a few years or maybe a decade, it's cool enough so that it can actually cool with air circulating through it by convection. So these are typically either metallic or concrete containers where spent fuel is stored. It's often stored outside, perhaps under some kind of covering to protect it against weather, but nothing much more than that.
That's interesting. It seems almost like a lower tech solution to the problem.
Right, but it's a temporary solution because most of these places, most of the communities don't want the spent fuel to stay there forever. And secondly, once the reactor shuts down, who is going to look after these? So the utilities that operate these reactors also don't want to have the responsibility of dealing with these well after the reactor that was generating profits for them has shut down.
Right. Yeah, I could see how that, if there's no planning, if there was an assumption that there was going to be a place ahead of time to put them in, there isn't, I could see how that could affect the economics there. Well, we're running low on time, so I just wanted to ask you a couple of sort of more general questions about moving forward with this field. You've mentioned that this is an international problem. I'm wondering if you can talk about if people are working more in international teams, in cross-disciplinary teams to try to solve some of these issues, and if those kinds of combined perspectives have been helpful in addressing some of these problems.
Yeah. Certainly, yes. I think international collaboration has helped in terms of trying to deal with waste storage, for example. Countries have learned from each other in terms of what has worked and what has not worked. And there's also been international efforts at trying to standardize some reactor design practices, safety practices, and so on and so forth. That said, there's also a limit to which they can collaborate because nuclear power is also very competitive enterprise. So in terms of nuclear reactor sales, for example, there's so few reactors that are ordered that every reactor vendor is sort of after each of these orders. And so these competitions tend to be very intense. So there is a limit to how much they can collaborate. So each of them tries to also keep their little secrets to themselves. So there's that.
Right, that's interesting. And I'm sure that people from different countries and different levels of developing country also have different perspectives about what's the most important factors to be dealing with when you're dealing with these issues.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
Right.
There are lots of conflicts of interest in terms of what they want versus what somebody else wants.
Mm-hmm. So just to sort of give us a summarizing statement here as a closure for our talk here today, I wonder if you can kind of give a little bit of a sum up about where you think this industry is going. It sounds very negative, I have to say, in terms of the prospects for it, but do you really feel that this is basically an industry in decline, or are there other considerations?
It's very hard to predict the future. It's a very risky business. But if you look at the trends, they do show an industry in decline. At the same time, the nuclear industry is a very powerful industry, as I mentioned. They have very high levels of political support in many different countries. There are a lot of very rich people who like nuclear power, to put it so bluntly. And so it's not going to go away anytime soon either. So I think what we're going to be seeing is something which is very slowly sort of running into the sunset, unless there's some dramatic breakthrough in the next decade or two. And the chances for that, I must say, are also not very bright, because a lot of ideas have been tried before. As I said, there are very few reactor designs that are genuinely new. Most of these reactor designs have been thought about in the 1950s, and they've been abandoned because they're not working out for one reason or the other. So there's not a lot to be sort of hopeful for. At the same time, there are also huge challenges. I think the challenge of trying to deal with waste is one thing which is still very much present. Decommissioning nuclear reactors is going to be another big issue that's going to come up, and so on. So there are also interesting technical and other challenges which are still in front of us.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there for now, but it's been a very interesting and very enlightening discussion. I really appreciate your insights. I know that all our viewers do as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope we can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Fenella, and thank you, everybody else.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.